The first light of dawn crept through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the sleek surfaces of Jackson Reed's Manhattan penthouse. 40 stories above Central Park, the city was already stirring to life, but inside the 4,200-square-foot luxury apartment, silence reigned. Jackson stood at the window, a porcelain cup of single-origin Ethiopian coffee cooling in his hand as he gazed at the skyline he'd conquered. "Mr. Reed, your 7:30 conference call with Tokyo has been moved to 8:15, announced the smart home system in its carefully modulated voice. "And Ms. Chen from accounting needs approval on the quarterly projections by noon." Jackson nodded absently, though there was no one to see the gesture. At 38, he had achieved everything he'd ever written in those ambitious high school journal entries. Ride Connect, the ride-sharing app he'd coded in a Stanford dorm room, had revolutionized urban transportation across North America. His net worth fluctuated between $3 and $4 billion, depending on the market's mood. He owned properties in 5 cities, had been on Forbes and Cover twice, and regularly spoke at technology summits alongside people he'd once idolized. And yet, most mornings began exactly like this. Standing alone, watching a city full of strangers living lives that somehow seemed more substantial than his own. The soft ping of the elevator announced Margaret's arrival. His executive assistant of 7 years had her own access code and typically arrived by 6:30 a.m. to prepare him for the day ahead. "Good morning, Mr. Reed," she called, her heels clicking efficiently across Italian marble. "I've sent the quarterly projections to your tablet and moved your lunch with the Singapore investors to 1:30. Jackson turned from the window, offering a reserved smile. "Why, thanks, Margaret. Coffee. Already had 2, but thank you," she replied, setting her leather portfolio on the kitchen island. "I wanted to confirm. Are you still planning to attend your high school reunion this weekend in Boston? The jet is on standby, and I've reserved your usual suite at the Four Seasons." The reunion, Jackson had almost forgotten about it, despite having received the embossed invitation months ago. 15 years since graduation from New England Preparatory Academy, 15 years since he'd walked away from the life he'd been expected to live. "I haven't decided," he said, setting down his cup. "Anything critical on the calendar?" Margaret glanced at her tablet. "Nothing that can't be handled remotely." "But," she paused, studying him with the practiced eye of someone who'd managed his life for nearly a decade. "May I speak candidly? Always. You haven't taken a personal day in 8 months. The board is concerned about burnout. Although they'd never say it to your face." Jackson checked his reflection in the polished kitchen surface. No visible signs of fatigue, but he felt it deep in his bones, a weariness that sleep couldn't touch. "I'm fine," he said automatically. "Are you?" Margaret's tone remained professional, but her eyes reflected genuine concern. "You've built an empire, Mr. Reed. Perhaps it wouldn't hurt to remember where you started." Where he started. Images flashed through his mind. The small Connecticut town where his father taught high school mathematics and his mother worked as a nurse. The basement computer where he'd taught himself to code while other teenagers were at football games. And Olivia, bright, beautiful Olivia Chambers, who had believed in him before anyone else. Jackson moved to his bedroom, opening the walk-in closet that was larger than his childhood home's entire first floor. At the back, behind the custom suits and designer shoes, sat an old cardboard box he'd never unpacked. He pulled it down, running his fingers over the dusty lid before opening it. Inside lay the remnants of a life abandoned, his high school valedictorian medal, early coding competition trophies, and at the bottom, a small velvet box containing the promise ring he'd never given Olivia the Christmas he broke her heart. His phone buzzed with a text from the CFO about the quarterly earnings call, dragging him back to the present. Jackson placed the velvet box back, closed the cardboard container, and made his decision. "Book the jet," he said, returning to the kitchen. "I'll go to Boston tomorrow." "Very good," Margaret replied, already typing on her tablet. "Any particular reason for the change of heart?" Jackson looked around at his immaculate and empty penthouse, the gleaming surfaces that held no fingerprints but his own, the pristine kitchen where he rarely cooked, the living room where he never entertained. Sometimes you need to look backward to move forward, he said quietly. As Margaret organized the details of his trip, Jackson's thoughts drifted to the classmates he'd once known. Had they built the lives they'd planned? Had they found happiness in the paths they'd chosen? And Olivia? What had become of the girl whose heart he'd broken in pursuit of his ambitions? For the first time in years, Jackson felt something stir within him beyond the relentless drive that had built his empire. Curiosity about roads not taken, and perhaps, though he wouldn't admit it even to himself, a longing for connection that all his wealth couldn't satisfy. The Tesla Model S purred to a halt in front of Boston's historic Langford Hotel, its sleek black exterior gleaming under the ornate entrance lights. Jackson checked his watch, 7:45 p.m. He was intentionally late. 15 minutes was enough to avoid the awkward early arrival small talk, but not so late as to make an entrance. "I'll text when I'm ready to leave," he told his driver, a retired Boston police officer named Frank, who'd been with his security team for 3 years. "Yes, sir. Enjoy your evening," Frank replied, his Boston accent thick with authenticity. As the car pulled away, Jackson felt an unexpected flutter of nerves. He'd addressed shareholders during market crashes and testified before Congress about data privacy. Yet the thought of facing people who knew him before he became Jackson, Reed tech pioneer, made his mouth dry. The Langford had been renovated since his last visit, but it retained its old-world charm. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors, and dark wood paneling that spoke of old money and tradition. Following the discreet signs for the New England Prep 15-year reunion, Jackson made his way to the grand ballroom. He paused at the entrance, taking a moment to prepare himself. "Name tag, sir." A cheerful young woman staffing the check-in table smiled up at him. "Jackson Reed," he said, watching as recognition dawned in her eyes. "Oh, Mr. Reed. We weren't sure you'd make it." She fumbled slightly as she located his pre-printed name tag. "Everyone's been wondering if you'd come." Of course they had. Jackson accepted the name tag with a polite nod, but didn't affix it to his lapel. He wouldn't need an introduction. As he entered the ballroom, the first face he recognized belonged to Tyler Matthews, former lacrosse captain, now sporting a hint of middle-age spread beneath his expensive suit. "Reed, holy shit, man, you actually showed." Tyler clapped, him on the shoulder with unnecessary force. "Guys, look who decided to grace us with his presence, the billionaire himself." And just like that, Jackson was surrounded. Former classmates materialized from all corners of the room, drinks in hand, eyes wide with curiosity or calculation or both. "Jackson, is it true you have your own island? Do you remember me? We had AP Physics together. My cousin works for Google and says your algorithm changed everything." He answered each question with practiced ease, deflecting personal inquiries with self-deprecating humor and technical questions with simplified explanations. This was familiar territory, the performance of being Jackson Reed, tech visionary, rather than just Jackson, the math teacher's son who'd left everything behind. As the initial excitement of his arrival faded and people drifted back to their previous conversations, Jackson made his way to the bar. He ordered a Macallan 18, neat, and took the opportunity to survey the room properly. Most of his classmates had followed predictable trajectories. The Type A overachievers were now doctors, lawyers, or finance professionals. The creative types had settled into teaching or small business ownership. A few had surprised him. Brett Carson, who'd been suspended 3 times for hacking the school's grading system, was now apparently a federal prosecutor, specializing in cybercrime. "Quite the crowd reaction," came a voice beside him. Jackson turned to find Hannah. Kim, once Olivia's closest friend. Time had been kind to Hannah. Her face showed few lines, though her formerly jet black hair now contained strategic caramel highlights. "Hannah," he said, genuinely pleased to see her. "You look fantastic. Still breaking hearts in radiology." "Cardiology now," she corrected with a smile. "I specialized after residency, but enough about me. You're the celebrity in the room." Jackson shrugged. "Just lucky timing with some code." $3 billion isn't just luck," Hannah replied, her shrewd eyes studying him, "though I've always wondered if it was worth what you left behind." The directness of her statement caught him. Off guard, Hannah had never been one to mince words. "Is she here?" he asked, not bothering to pretend he didn't know who Hannah meant. Hannah's knowing smile told him not to bother with pretense. "Not yet. She texted that she's running late, something about a teenage crisis." Jackson nearly choked on his scotch. Teenage. "Her son," Hannah confirmed, watching his reaction carefully. "Daniel. He's 15 now." The mathematics was inescapable. 15 years since graduation. 15 years since he'd left Olivia behind. A 15-year-old son. "I didn't know she'd married," Jackson said, keeping his voice neutral while his mind raced through calculations. Hannah's expression shifted to something unreadable. She didn't. Before Jackson could process this information, a commotion at the ballroom entrance drew everyone's attention. A woman with chestnut hair styled in an elegant shoulder-length cut had entered, accompanied by a lanky teenage boy whose eyes were fixed on his phone with the singular focus of adolescence. Even across the room, Jackson would have known her anywhere. Olivia Chambers had the same warm smile, the same graceful way of moving through a crowd, though she now carried herself with a confidence that spoke of battles fought and won. "There she is," Hannah murmured unnecessarily. "I should go say hello. Coming." But Jackson couldn't move. His eyes were locked not on Olivia, but on the boy beside her. As the teenager finally looked up from his phone, irritation clear on his face at being dragged to this boring adult function, Jackson felt the room tilt slightly. The boy had Jackson's eyes. Not just the color, but the shape, the intensity. His jaw had the same sharp line that Jackson had inherited from his grandfather. Even his posture, slightly hunched over his phone, mirrored Jackson's own stance when coding. "Jackson, are you okay?" Hannah asked, concerned by his sudden pallor. The Macallan slipped from his fingers, the heavy crystal tumbler shattering against the marble floor. The sharp crack silenced nearby conversations, drawing all eyes to him, including, finally, Olivia's. When their gazes met across the crowded ballroom, 15 years collapsed into nothing. In her eyes, Jackson saw recognition, apprehension, and something else, a steely determination that told him she'd been preparing for this moment for a very long time. The boy, Daniel, followed his mother's gaze, his brow furrowing in confusion before widening in recognition. He tugged at Olivia's sleeve, his mouth forming words Jackson couldn't hear but could easily guess. "Is that Jackson Reed?" The Jackson Reed. As hotel staff rushed to clean up the broken glass at his feet, Jackson remained frozen, his mind racing through impossible calculations and inevitable conclusions. The son he never knew he had was standing 30 feet away, looking at him with innocent curiosity, unaware that he was staring into a mirror of his own future. "Sir, please step back while we clean this up," a young staff member said, gently guiding Jackson away from the shattered glass. He moved mechanically, his eyes never leaving the pair across the room. Olivia was whispering something to Daniel, her hand on his shoulder in a gesture both protective and reassuring. The boy nodded, his excitement evident even from a distance. Whatever she had told him, it clearly wasn't the truth. There was none of the shock or betrayal that would accompany such a revelation. Hannah returned to Jackson's side, her expression grave. "You didn't know," she said. "It wasn't a question." "How could I?" he replied, his voice hoarse. "She never told me." "That's a conversation for the two of you," Hannah said, squeezing his arm briefly. "But Jackson, don't make this about you. That boy has lived 15 years without knowing his father. Whatever happens next, remember that." With that parting wisdom, Hannah crossed the room to embrace Olivia, providing a momentary buffer as Jackson struggled to compose himself. His mind, normally adept at processing complex algorithms and market projections, who seemed unable to compute the simple reality before him. He had a son. A living, breathing extension of himself had been walking the earth for 15 years without his knowledge. When Hannah stepped aside, Olivia and Daniel began making their way toward him. Jackson straightened his spine, falling back on the boardroom posture that had carried him through 1,000 uncomfortable meetings. but no hostile takeover or investor crisis had ever made his heart hammer like this. "Hello, Jackson," Olivia said when they reached him, her voice steady despite the tension evident in her shoulders. "It's been a long time." Up close, she was even more beautiful than he remembered, not with the unfinished beauty of youth, but with the defined elegance of a woman who knew her worth. Fine lines at the corners of her eyes spoke of laughter and resilience. Her gaze held, his eyes unwavering. 15 years, he replied, the significance of the number hanging between them. Daniel thrust his hand forward with teenage awkwardness. "I'm Daniel Chambers. Your ride-sharing algorithm completely revolutionized transportation networks. I've been studying it for my AP computer science project." Jackson took the boy's hand automatically, feeling calluses from typing, just like his own at that age. The handshake was firm, another inherited trait. Up close, the resemblance was even more striking. Daniel had Jackson's height, his hands, even the slight cowlick at the crown of his head that never quite laid flat. "It's nice to meet you, Daniel," Jackson managed, surprised by how normal his voice sounded. "You're interested in computer science? Interested?" "He's obsessed," Olivia said with a fondness that made Jackson's chest ache. "He built his first app at 12. Currently, he's creating a program to help students with ADHD manage homework assignments." Pride swelled in Jackson's chest, an unfamiliar, powerful emotion for someone whose accomplishments had always been solely his own. "That's impressive. I'd like to hear more about it." Daniel's face brightened with genuine enthusiasm. "Really? Most adults just nod and change the subject. When I start talking code, I'm not most adults," Jackson said, the understatement of the century hanging unspoken. "Mom says you went to Stanford on scholarship," Daniel continued. "That's my dream school." "Did you like Northern California? Is the programming department as amazing as everyone says? Did you really code the first version of Ride Connect in a dorm room?" The questions tumbled out with adolescent eagerness, each one highlighting another connection, another shared interest, another piece of himself reflected back in this boy who didn't know they shared blood. Olivia watched their exchange. With a complex expression, part pride, part apprehension, part something Jackson couldn't quite name. When Daniel paused for breath, she gently intervened. "Daniel, why don't you go say hello to Ms. Kim? She's been asking about your coding project, and I'm sure she'd love an update." The boy looked reluctant to leave his tech idol but nodded. "Sure. Nice meeting you, Mr. Reed. Maybe we could talk more later." "I'd like that," Jackson said, meaning it more than he'd meant anything in years. As Daniel walked away, the artificial warmth of their reunion evaporated. Olivia's smile faded, replaced by the careful neutrality of someone bracing for impact. "He doesn't know," Jackson said, a statement rather than a question. "No." Olivia confirmed. "He thinks his father was a visiting professor from London who returned to England before I knew I was pregnant." The fiction stung more than Jackson expected. Creative story. "It was the best I could do at 22. Heartbroken and suddenly pregnant, after being told I'd likely never conceive due to my endometriosis," Olivia replied, her calm tone belied by the tension in her jaw. The British accent was Daniel's elaboration when he was 7. "I never had the heart to correct him." Jackson glanced around the crowded ballroom, acutely aware of the curious eyes watching their reunion. "We can't do this here. Is there somewhere we can talk privately?" Olivia hesitated, then nodded. "The hotel has a terrace on the mezzanine level. It should be quiet this time of year." As she led the way through the crowded ballroom, Jackson felt former classmates' eyes following them, their whispered speculations trailing in their wake. Someone, probably Tyler, called out something about catching up on old times, followed by knowing laughter. From across the room, Hannah caught his eye and gave him a small, encouraging nod. Whatever happened next, Jackson knew he was about to face the consequences of a choice made 15 years ago, a choice he hadn't fully understood at the time. The terrace overlooked Boston Common, city lights twinkling against the October darkness. A crisp autumn breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. Olivia wrapped her arms around herself. whether against the cold or his presence. Jackson couldn't tell. "When were you going to tell me?" he asked, his voice low but intense. "Were you ever going to tell me?" Olivia moved to the stone balustrade, her profile illuminated by the soft glow from nearby windows. "I've asked myself that same question for 15 years. You should have told me when you found out. That was my child too." The words came out harsher than he intended, fueled by the shock of discovery and 15 years of lost moments. Was it?" Olivia's gaze hardened as she turned to face him. "You made your choice very clear, Jackson. Stanford, Silicon Valley, your dreams, there wasn't room for us. You broke things off because a long-distance relationship was too much of a distraction from your goals." She shook her head. "What would you have done if I'd called 2 weeks later to say, 'By the way, I'm pregnant'? Would you have given up Stanford, your first startup, that Series A funding you got at 22? His silence was answer enough. "That's what I thought," she said quietly. "I made the decision I believed was best for everyone. My parents helped me finish college while raising Daniel. I built a successful architecture firm. Daniel has grown up loved and supported. Without his father," Jackson added, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. "Yes," Olivia acknowledged. "Without a father who chose ambition over love, was I wrong to spare him that knowledge?" The question hung between them, unanswerable. Jackson turned away, gripping the terrace railing as he struggled to process 15 years of missed moments, first steps, first words, first day of school, birthdays and Christmases. Father-son, conversations that had never happened, a childhood he could never get back. "You never looked for me," Olivia said suddenly. "All these years, building your empire, becoming famous enough to be recognized by teenagers interested in tech. You never once tried to find out what happened to me." The accusation struck home. She was right. He'd buried himself in work, in achievement, in the next goal and the next never allowing himself to look back, never giving himself permission to wonder about the girl he'd left behind. "I convinced myself it was better that way," he admitted. "That you were better off without me dragging you into my obsessive work life, that you deserved someone who could put you first." He met her eyes. "I told myself I was being noble, but maybe I was just being a coward." Olivia's expression softened slightly at his honesty. "We were so young, neither of us knew what we were doing." "He has your strength," Jackson said after a moment. I could see it in the way he carries himself." A smile touched Olivia's lips. "He has your brilliance with computers, and your determination, and your laugh. God, the first time I heard him really laugh, it almost broke me. It was like hearing you again." Jackson closed his eyes against the pain of it. "Does anyone else know, besides Hannah? My parents, my sister, my closest friends? No one in Daniel's life has ever slipped. And now? What happens now?" Jackson asked, suddenly feeling like the uncertain teenager he'd once been. Not the business titan who commanded boardrooms. Olivia looked back through the glass doors at their son, who was animatedly showing something on his phone to a group of fascinated adults. "That depends," she said softly, "on whether you're finally ready to make a different choice." The weight of her words pressed against his chest. This wasn't a business decision with clear metrics and calculable risks. This was messier, more complex, a human equation with too many variables and no guaranteed outcome. "I want to know him," Jackson said finally. "I've lost 15 years. I don't want to lose anymore." Relief flickered across Olivia's face, quickly replaced by caution. "I want that for him too. But this has to be careful, thoughtful. Daniel has built his entire identity without knowing you. Learning the truth will shake everything he believes about himself. So what do you suggest?" Jackson asked, finishing his now cold coffee. "A beginning," Olivia said. "Not as his father, not yet, but as someone in his life. Let him know you for who you are now before he learns who you were to me then. It wasn't enough, nothing could compensate for 15 years of absence. but it was a start, a path forward through uncharted territory. There's a regional coding competition next weekend at MIT, Olivia continued. Daniel's presenting his project. You could offer to be a mentor, offer technical guidance this week. It would seem natural given your interaction at the reunion. Jackson nodded slowly. And then we take it one step at a time, Olivia said. For Daniel's sake. From inside the ballroom, a burst of laughter drew their attention. Daniel was at the center of a small group, demonstrating something on his phone, his face animated with enthusiasm. For a moment, watching him, Jackson saw himself at that age, eager, brilliant, certain that technology could solve any problem if approached correctly. Except the problem before him now couldn't be solved with code or algorithms. It required something he'd neglected for years while building his empire: emotional intelligence, patience, and the courage to face his past mistakes. I'm staying in Boston, he decided aloud. I'll have my team find me a place. Ride Connect can be run from anywhere. Olivia looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. 15 years ago, you couldn't wait to leave New England behind. 15 years ago, I didn't know what I was leaving. Jackson replied. As they moved back toward the ballroom doors, Olivia paused with her hand on the handle. Jackson, whatever happens next, please remember, he's not a project to be optimized or a problem to be solved. He's a person with his own feelings and needs. I know, Jackson said, though in truth, he didn't. Not really. He'd never been a parent, never had to put someone else's needs above his own ambitions. It was unfamiliar territory, frightening in a way that business risks had never been. But looking through the glass at the son he never knew he had, Jackson felt something shift inside him, priorities realigning, values recalibrating. For the first time in years, success meant something different than stock prices and market share. It meant earning the right to be part of his son's life, whatever that might look like. Impressive setup, Jackson commented, glancing around MIT's Ray and Maria Stata Center, where dozens of young programmers had gathered for the regional coding competition. The architectural marvel of glass and metal, designed by Frank Gehry, and seemed appropriate for an event celebrating innovation. Daniel's been preparing for months, Olivia said, standing beside him at the entrance to the main exhibition hall. His project is in the Student Innovation category, Section C4. Over the past week, Jackson had met with Daniel twice, once to offer technical advice on his homework management app, and again to help refine his presentation for today's competition. Both meetings had been arranged with careful casualness. The successful tech entrepreneur taking interest in a promising young talent after a chance reunion introduction. The first meeting had been awkward, held at a coffee shop near Olivia's Cambridge home. Jackson had arrived 20 minutes early, rehearsing what he would say, how he would act. Normal behavior for a mentor, not a father meeting his son for the first real conversation. When Daniel arrived, backpack bulging with equipment, Jackson had been struck again by the physical similarities he'd missed for 15 years. This is weird, right? Daniel had said unexpectedly as he unpacked his laptop. I mean, you're actually Jackson Reed. Don't you have, like, a company to run or something? The directness, so like Jackson's own, had broken the tension. Companies run themselves when you hire the right people, Jackson had replied. And sometimes it's good to remember what got you excited about technology in the first place. Now, a week later, watching Daniel set up his display booth with meticulous care, Jackson felt a complex mixture of pride, regret, and something he rarely experienced: uncertainty. The carefully constructed narrative of his life, brilliant coder becomes tech visionary, had acquired an unexpected chapter, one he had no blueprint for navigating. Should we go over? Jackson asked, suddenly unsure of his place in this scenario. Olivia shook her head. Let him focus. The judges will be coming through in about 20 minutes. He knows we're here for support. They found seats along the perimeter, watching as Daniel made final adjustments to his presentation. Other parents and mentors filtered in, some hovering anxiously, others maintaining a calculated distance from their nervous teenagers. "Uchi, you've done an amazing job with him," Jackson said quietly. "He's confident, articulate, passionate." "He's always been driven," Olivia replied. "Even as a little boy, he'd get so focused on projects that he'd forget to eat. I'd find him surrounded by Lego pieces or puzzle bits, completely absorbed." "I was the same way," Jackson admitted. "My mother used to set timers to remind me to come up for air when I was coding." The shared trait hung between them. Another piece of Jackson living on in Daniel. Another connection that transcended the years of separation. From Daniel's perspective across the room, the exhibition hall buzzed with nervous energy. He adjusted his display screen for the 5th time, ensuring the app's interface was perfectly visible. His stomach twisted with nervous excitement, not just about the competition, but because Jackson Reed was here, watching, evaluating. When his mother had first mentioned that the tech billionaire had offered mentoring, Daniel had been skeptical. Why would someone like that care about a high school student's project? But over their 2 meetings, Jackson had treated him like an equal, challenging his code logic, suggesting smart improvements, seeming genuinely impressed by what Daniel had created. "Sir, stop fidgeting with the display," advised Lisa, a fellow competitor setting up nearby. "You're going to mess something up if you keep tweaking it." "Easy for you to say," Daniel muttered. "You don't have the founder of Ride Connect watching your presentation." Lisa's eyes widened. "Jackson Reed is here, for you." Daniel nodded, his chest swelling slightly with pride despite himself. "He's been mentoring me this week. Says my app has real potential." "That's insane," Lisa whispered, glancing toward where Jackson and Olivia sat. "Is he as intense as they say?" Daniel considered this as he adjusted his notes. "Not exactly. More focused, like he sees things other people miss." He paused. "Weirdly enough, we think a lot alike. Mom says it's because great minds work the same way. But sometimes it's almost like..." "Attention participants," a voice announced over the speakers, interrupting his thought. "Judges will begin their rounds in 5 minutes. Please complete your setup." As the judges approached Daniel's station, Jackson resisted the urge to move closer. Instead, he watched from afar as his son straightened his posture and launched into his prepared demonstration, his hands moving with the same precise gestures Jackson used when explaining complex technical concepts. "He has your mannerisms," Olivia murmured, as if reading his thoughts. "The way he taps his fingers when he's thinking, how he tilts his head when he's confused. Little things I've seen every day for 15 years. The observation sent a pang through Jackson's chest. Daily moments of connection Olivia had experienced that he never would. He pushed the feeling aside, focusing instead on Daniel's presentation. The boy was clearly impressing the judges, who nodded and made notes as he demonstrated his app's functionality. When the judging concluded, Daniel searched the crowd, spotting them and waving enthusiastically. Jackson and Olivia approached his booth together. "How did it go?" Olivia asked, straightening his already straight collar in that universal mothering gesture. "Mom, stop," Daniel protested, ducking away with teenage embarrassment. "I think it went well. They asked about scalability and integration. With school learning management systems." He turned to Jackson, eyes bright with excitement. "I used that explanation of API architecture you showed me. They seemed really impressed." "You did the impressive part," Jackson replied, careful not to overstep while still offering genuine praise. "The concept is solid, and your execution is remarkably clean for someone your age." Daniel beamed at the compliment. "They announce finalists at 3. Can you stay until then, Jack? Mr. Reed? I mean, I know you must be busy with actual billion-dollar work and everything." "I cleared my schedule," Jackson assured him, something warm unfurling in his chest at Daniel's slip toward informality. "Please, call me Jackson. Mr. Reed makes me feel ancient." "Cool," Daniel grinned. "There's a panel discussion on entrepreneurship in tech in the main auditorium while we wait. Want to check it out?" As they walked together to the auditorium, Daniel peppered Jackson with questions about venture capital, startup incubators, and scaling challenges. Olivia trailed slightly behind, watching their interaction with a mixture of emotions playing across her face. When the announcement came that Daniel had placed second in his category, earning a $1,500 scholarship prize and summer coding camp opportunity, his face lit up with pure joy. Without thinking, Jackson clapped him on the shoulder in congratulation, the first physical contact between father and son. The moment hung suspended, heavy with meaning only two of them understood. Later, as they celebrated over dinner at an upscale pizza place in Cambridge, Jackson watched Daniel animatedly describe his plans to expand the app's functionality. Across the table, Olivia caught his eye. A silent acknowledgement passing. Between them, this was working, this careful introduction, this building of bridges across 15 years of absence. As they were leaving the restaurant, Daniel surprised them both. "So, I've been thinking," he began, with the cautious tone of a teenager about to ask for something significant. "If Jackson has time, maybe he could help me develop the next version, like regular mentoring sessions or something." Olivia's eyes widened slightly. "Daniel, Jackson is an incredibly busy person. We can't impose on him like that." "Actually," Jackson interjected, "I'm planning to stay in Boston for a while. Opening an East Coast office has been on my radar." The decision, made on impulse days ago, now felt like the most natural thing in the world. "I'd be happy to work with you on your project, Daniel, if it's okay with your mom." The hope in Daniel's eyes as he turned to Olivia made any corporate obligation seem trivial by comparison. "Please, Mom, this is like the opportunity of a lifetime." Olivia hesitated only briefly before nodding. "If Jackson has the time, and if you keep your grades up, I think it would be wonderful." On the sidewalk outside the restaurant, as Daniel raced ahead to examine a Tesla Model X parked nearby, Olivia turned to Jackson. "Are you sure about this? Staying in Boston, getting involved in his life. Once this starts, there's no going back." Jackson watched his son circling the electric vehicle, pointing out design features to himself. "I've spent 15 years building a company," he said quietly. "It's time I built something that actually matters." 2 months had passed since the coding competition. Winter had descended on Boston with characteristic New England intensity, transforming the city into a landscape of white-dusted buildings and steel-gray skies. Jackson had leased a temporary office space in Boston's Seaport district, converting the largest conference room into a collaborative workspace where he and Daniel spent hours refining what was now officially named Focus Flow. "The problem isn't the code itself," Jackson explained, leaning over Daniel's shoulder to point at the laptop screen. "It's the user experience flow. You're thinking like a programmer, not like a 15-year-old with ADHD who's overwhelmed by homework." "So I should simplify the input process?" Daniel asked, fingers already flying across the keyboard to adjust the interface. "Exactly. Remember, cognitive load is your enemy. Each additional click or field creates friction." Jackson watched as Daniel implemented the changes with remarkable speed. Perfect. Now test how it feels." As Daniel worked, Jackson studied him surreptitiously. The past 2 months had been a revelation, discovering his son's quirks and talents piece by piece. Daniel was brilliant with systems logic, but sometimes missed human elements in design. He had Jackson's focused intensity but Olivia's empathy. He drank alarming amounts of orange soda, could recite extensive dialogue from obscure sci-fi shows, and drummed his fingers in the exact same pattern Jackson did when thinking. Not everything had been smooth sailing. 3 weeks into their arrangement, they'd had their first real argument when Jackson pushed back on Daniel's insistence on adding complex features before perfecting the core functionality. "You're over-engineering it," Jackson had said firmly. "Start simple, get it working, then iterate." "That's easy for you to say," Daniel had snapped. "Your first app was basic too, but you've had years to build Ride Connect into what it is now. I need mine to stand out immediately." "And it will," Jackson had countered, "by working flawlessly, rather than crashing under the weight of unnecessary features." They'd glared at each other, two stubbornly identical expressions, of frustration, before Daniel had grudgingly conceded the point. Looking back, Jackson realized it had been an important moment, treating Daniel not as a child to be indulged, but as a developer whose work deserved honest critique. "I should head out soon," Daniel said now, checking his watch. "Mom's hosting that dinner party tonight for her firm's 10th anniversary. She's been cooking all day." "Need a ride?" Jackson offered. He'd recently purchased a modest townhouse in Beacon Hill, not far from Olivia's Cambridge home, another commitment to his new East Coast life. "That would be great." "Thanks." Daniel began packing up his materials. "Hey, I've been meaning to ask you something. For my social studies project, we're interviewing people about pivotal life choices. Would you be willing to talk about your decision to leave New England for Stanford? How you knew it was the right choice to go across the country?" Jackson froze momentarily. These innocent questions about his past had become increasingly frequent and increasingly difficult to navigate without outright lies. "Sure," he managed, "though I'm not convinced it was entirely the right choice. In retrospect." Daniel looked up, surprised. "Really? But it led to everything. Ride Connect, your success. If you'd stayed local, none of that might have happened." "True, but success isn't only measured in companies built or money earned." Jackson chose his words carefully. "There are other things I missed out on that no amount of professional achievement can replace." Daniel tilted his head questioningly, the same gesture Olivia made when puzzling through a problem. "Like what?" "Connections, family." Jackson gathered his own coat, avoiding Daniel's curious gaze. "But life isn't just about what you build, it's about who you build it with." The drive to Cambridge was filled with Daniel's excited chatter about the upcoming presentation to Ride Connect's development team, who had expressed interest in potentially acquiring the application as part of the company's educational outreach program. For Olivia, the past 2 months had brought changes she'd never anticipated. After 15 years of raising Daniel alone, suddenly Jackson was a fixture in their lives, picking Daniel up from school sometimes, joining them for dinner at least once a week, becoming the person Daniel texted when he solved a difficult coding problem or needed advice only another tech mind would understand. She'd watch their relationship develop with complicated emotions. Joy at seeing Daniel flourish under Jackson's guidance, relief at finally sharing the burden of parenting a gifted teenager, and beneath it all, a gnawing anxiety about where this was all heading. Tonight, arranging canapés for her firm's anniversary dinner, she found herself checking her phone more frequently than necessary, waiting for Jackson's text that he was dropping Daniel off. "Like you're hovering by that phone like a teenager waiting for a prom invite," teased her business partner, Elena. "Hot date later?" "Just Daniel getting a ride home from Jackson," Olivia replied, trying to sound casual. Elena raised an eyebrow. "Jackson Reed, who's suddenly relocated to Boston and happens to be mentoring your son. The same Jackson Reed who's been single for years despite being linked to models and tech heiresses." She sipped her wine meaningfully. "Interesting coincidence." Olivia concentrated on arranging the food. "It's complicated. Most worthwhile things are," Elena replied. "But I've known you for 10 years, Liv. You seem happier these past months, despite whatever complicated means." Before Olivia could respond, she heard the side door open and Daniel's voice calling out, "Mom!" "We're back." "We're back." Not "I'm back." The casual plurality wasn't lost on her. "In the kitchen," she called, smoothing her hair automatically. Daniel bounded in, followed by Jackson, who looked unexpectedly domestic in jeans and a casual sweater rather than his usual tailored suits. "Jackson helped me fix the interface issues," Daniel announced, "and he thinks we should present to the Ride Connect team next week if possible." "That sounds wonderful," Olivia said, trying not to notice how naturally Jackson moved into their space, hanging his coat on the hook by the door as if he'd been doing it for years. "Will you be staying for dinner, Jackson? There's plenty." "I shouldn't impose on your work event," he demurred. "At least come see the improvements. I made to Focus Flow last night," Daniel insisted. "It'll just take a minute, and then you can escape the architects and their endless discussions about load-bearing walls." Olivia watched them disappear upstairs to Daniel's room, struck by how quickly her carefully constructed life had expanded to include Jackson. For 15 years, it had been just her and Daniel, their routines and rhythms established through countless small daily negotiations. Now Jackson moved through their home with increasing ease, his presence altering the family dynamics in ways neither Olivia nor Daniel seemed to mind. It frightened her how natural it felt, and how much she was beginning to depend on his presence. Later that evening, after the dinner party had wound down and the last guest had departed, Olivia found herself sitting on the porch swing with Jackson, both nursing cups of herbal tea despite the winter chill. Inside, Daniel was on a video call with his coding club, explaining the latest features of Focus Flow with animated gestures visible through the window. "Thank you for tonight," Olivia said, "for bringing him home, for staying for the dinner, for all of it." "I should be thanking you," Jackson replied, "but for allowing me into his life, into your lives, after everything." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching their breath form clouds in the cold air. "He asked me today about leaving for Stanford," Jackson said finally, "about how I knew it was the right choice." Olivia tensed slightly. "What did you tell him?" "That I wasn't sure it was entirely the right choice. That success came at a cost I didn't fully understand at the time." He turned to look at her. "But we can't keep doing this much longer, Olivia. The questions are getting more specific, the gaps in the story more obvious. Soon he's going to start putting pieces together." "I know," she admitted, wrapping her hands tighter around her mug for warmth. "I've been thinking about when and how to tell him. I'm afraid of how it will change everything." "It will change things," Jackson acknowledged. "But maybe not in the ways we fear. He's smart, resilient, and he already likes me." A hint of wonder colored his voice at that last part. "He more than likes you. He idolizes you." Olivia's voice carried a warning, which makes this all the more delicate. Finding out his tech hero is actually his father, and that we've both been lying to him, that's a lot for anyone to process, especially a teenager. Inside, Daniel laughed at something on his call, the sound carrying through the glass, bright and uncomplicatedly happy. Both Jackson and Olivia turned instinctively toward the sound, their movements mirror images of parental attention. "Next week," Olivia decided suddenly, "after his presentation to your team, whatever happens with the app, good or bad, we'll tell him together the next day." She met Jackson's eyes. "It's time." Neither of them could have known that the carefully planned revelation would never happen, that fate had other, less controlled circumstances in mind for the truth to emerge. Daniel's presentation to the Ride Connect development team had gone better than anyone expected. The senior developers had asked insightful questions, suggested thoughtful improvements, and ultimately recommended acquiring Focus Flow as the company's first educational technology initiative. Jackson had watched with undisguised pride as his son fielded complex technical questions with confidence and clarity. "We'll need to talk about compensation and credit," the head of product development had said. "Oh, but we're very interested in bringing this under the Ride Connect umbrella with you as the lead developer, despite your age." Now, the day after this triumph, Daniel's mind buzzed with possibilities as he searched through his mother's home office for his backup drive. The Ride Connect team wanted additional documentation on his development process, and he'd stored progress screenshots and notes there. "Mom, have you seen my external drive? The blue one," he called out. "Check the desk drawer in the study," she called back from the kitchen, where she and Jackson were preparing a celebratory dinner. "That's where I put it after vacuuming yesterday." Daniel pulled open the drawer, rummaging through neatly organized office supplies. At the back, he found the blue drive tangled with some rarely used cables. As he tugged it free, he accidentally knocked an older-looking leather portfolio to the floor, its contents spilling across the hardwood. "Great," he muttered, kneeling to gather the scattered papers, mostly old sketches from his mother's early architecture projects. At the bottom of the pile lay a photo album he'd never seen before, its cover worn around the edges. Curious. He flipped it open. The first page held photos from his mother's high school graduation, her younger face beaming at the camera, diploma in hand, surrounded by grandparents Daniel barely remembered and his still-living grandmother. He turned the page, smiling at his mother's youthful fashion choices and outdated hairstyle. Then he froze, his breath catching in his throat. There, spread across 2 pages, were photos of his mother with Jackson Reed. Not recent photos. These showed them as teenagers, arms around each other, unmistakably a couple. Prom photos, beach day photos, study session photos where they leaned close over textbooks. "What the?" Daniel whispered, his mind racing to reconcile these images with everything he knew, or thought he knew, about his mother's past and his own origins. He flipped forward frantically, finding more evidence of a relationship he'd never been told existed. His mother and Jackson in senior year, clearly in love. Jackson in a Stanford sweatshirt, his mother looking sad, beside him. Then abruptly, the photos of Jackson stopped, and several pages later, baby photos of Daniel appeared. The mathematics was inescapable, the timeline unmistakable. His hands trembling, Daniel carried the album into the kitchen, where his mother was laughing at something Jackson had said, their easy familiarity now taking on an entirely different meaning. They both looked up when he entered, their smiles fading simultaneously as they saw what he held. "Daniel," Olivia said, softly, concern replacing her laughter. "You knew each other," Daniel said, his voice unnaturally calm. "Not just why I went to the same school. You were together." Olivia stepped forward, her hand outstretched. "Daniel, I can explain. When were you going to tell me?" he demanded, slamming the album shut. "Or were you never going to say anything? Just keep pretending that my father was some nameless British professor who disappeared before I was born." His gaze shifted to Jackson, hurt and betrayal radiating from eyes identical to Jackson's own. "And you? All these months of mentoring and of acting like you were just some successful guy taking an interest in my coding. It was all a lie." "Not all of it," Jackson said, finding his voice at last. "My interest in you, in your work, that's been genuine from the start. But you knew who I was," Daniel insisted. "You knew the whole time." "Not before the reunion," Olivia interjected. "Jackson didn't know about you until that night. I never told him I was pregnant." Daniel's eyes widened as he processed this new information. "So you abandoned her, but not me specifically." The accusation struck Jackson like a physical blow. I didn't know. If I had..." "What?" Daniel challenged. "If you had known, what would you have done differently? Stayed? Given up Stanford? Given up becoming a billionaire?" He laughed bitterly. "I doubt it. Daniel, please." Olivia moved toward him, but he backed away. "We were going to tell you tomorrow. We had it all planned." "Oh, you had it all planned," Daniel repeated, his voice cracking. "Like you planned to lie to me my entire life about who my father was. Like you planned to let me believe some fiction about a British professor instead of telling me the truth." His chest felt tight, emotions he couldn't even name crashing through him like waves. Everything he thought he knew about himself, about his family history, about the past few months. All of it was built on deception. "I thought," he struggled to find the words, "I thought we were connecting because we think alike, because we're both into the same things. But it was biology all along, DNA, not some miraculous meeting of like minds." Jackson stepped forward cautiously. "It's both, Daniel. Yes, we share DNA, but the connection we've built these past months, that's real. That's not just genetics." "How would you know?" Daniel shot back. "You weren't there for 15 years. You don't get to show up now and claim some deep understanding of me or what I'm feeling." The hurt on Jackson's face was evident, but Daniel was too angry to care. He turned to his mother. "And you've been the one person I always trusted completely." His voice broke. "You lied to me every single day of my life." Tears filled Olivia's eyes. "I thought I was protecting you. I thought..." "I need to get out of here," Daniel interrupted, turning toward the door. "I need to think." Where are you going? Olivia asked, panic edging into her voice. Out. I need space. Don't follow me. The door slammed with a finality that echoed through the house, leaving Jackson and Olivia standing in stunned silence. Outside, they heard the sound of Daniel's bicycle being roughly dragged from the side of the house, then the squeal of tires as he pedaled away into the winter evening. Olivia sank into a chair, her face in her hands. This isn't how it was supposed to happen. We were going to tell him together when the time was right. Jackson remained standing, frozen in place by the impact of what had just occurred. He hates me, he said quietly. Not for leaving 16 years ago, but for the lies these past months. He's hurt and confused, Olivia corrected, looking up with tear-filled eyes. He doesn't hate either of us, but his entire understanding of his life, his identity, has just been upended. The sound of the oven timer interrupted them, a jarring reminder of the celebration dinner that now seemed absurdly irrelevant. I'll find him, Jackson said firmly, already reaching for his coat. You stay here in case he comes back. Olivia hesitated, torn between her instinct to search for her son herself and the recognition that this moment might be important for Jackson and Daniel's relationship. Trust me with this, Jackson, said I, meeting her eyes. Please. After a moment, she nodded. He might go to the river. There's a spot near the MIT boathouse where he goes to think sometimes. Or the 24-hour diner on Massachusetts Avenue. Daniel likes their hot chocolate when he's upset. I'll find him, Jackson promised, already heading for the door. Whatever it takes. The temperature had dropped sharply after nightfall, and Jackson's breath formed white clouds as he drove slowly through Cambridge's streets. He'd already checked the riverside spot Olivia had mentioned, finding it deserted except for a few hardy joggers braving the cold. The diner on Massachusetts Avenue had yielded nothing as well, the weary waitress shaking her head when shown Daniel's photo. Jackson fought rising panic as he called Daniel's phone for the 8th time, reaching voicemail yet again. Where would a hurt, confused teenager go on a frigid winter night? Then it hit him. Where would he himself have gone? At that age, seeking solace or answers? The realization struck him suddenly. Turning the car around, he headed toward MIT's campus, specifically the computer science building. When he'd visited for the coding competition, Daniel had mentioned spending time there whenever possible, fascinated by the history of technological innovation that had occurred within its walls. The Ray and Maria Stata Center stood like a deconstructed puzzle against the night sky. Its angled walls and unusual geometry, a fitting home for unconventional thinkers. Jackson parked and approached the building, relieved to find the lobby, accessible with student ID cards, which meant Daniel, with his precocious connections to the computer science department, likely had access. Inside, the building was eerily quiet, most students having departed for the evening. Jackson moved through corridors lined with research posters and technological artifacts, listening for any sound that might lead him to his son. On the 3rd floor, in an open student workspace filled with desks and computer terminals, he finally spotted a solitary figure. Daniel sat hunched in front of a darkened monitor, not working, just staring at the blank screen, his bicycle helmet still strapped to his backpack beside him. Jackson approached slowly, making enough noise that Daniel would hear him coming. The boy didn't turn around, though his shoulders tensed, indicating he was aware of Jackson's presence. Your mother's worried, Jackson said simply, stopping several feet away to give Daniel space. I texted her that I'm fine, Daniel replied, his voice flat. You didn't need to come looking for me. Yes, I did. Jackson moved to a chair nearby but didn't sit. Good. What kind of father would I be if I didn't? Daniel finally turned, his eyes red-rimmed but dry. That's just it. What kind of father are you? Because I don't know anymore. Everything I thought I knew was a lie. Jackson considered, his next words carefully. This moment, this conversation, would define their relationship moving forward. Not everything, he said finally. Your mother loves you more than anything in this world. That's the most important truth. And you, Daniel challenged. What's your truth? My truth is that I made a terrible mistake 16 years ago, Jackson admitted, pulling a chair closer and sitting down at Daniel's eye level. I chose ambition over love, believing I couldn't have both. When I left for Stanford, I convinced myself I was doing the right thing for both your mother and me. We were young, with different dreams, different paths. But if you had known about me, the question, direct, unavoidable, demanded equal honesty. I want to say I would have made a different choice, that I would have stayed or found a way to make it work. But the truth is, I don't know what 22-year-old me would have done. I was selfish, driven, convinced my path to success required shedding all connections to my past. Daniel flinched at this brutal honesty, but Jackson continued. What I do know, with absolute certainty, is what I would choose now. If I could go back with the knowledge I have today, I would choose differently, not because it's the right thing to do, but because these past months with you have shown me what truly matters. Daniel looked away, but not before Jackson caught the glimmer of tears. Why didn't you tell me the truth from the beginning, after the reunion? We were trying to protect you, Jackson said. Your mother and I agreed that springing this on you, that the tech entrepreneur you admired was actually your biological father, would be too much, too suddenly. We wanted you to get to know me first, to establish a relationship before adding the weight of biological connection. So more lies to protect me, Daniel said bitterly, like the fictional British professor. Yes, Jackson acknowledged. Wrong or right, that was our reasoning. But I've come to realize that protecting someone often means protecting yourself as well. I was afraid you would reject me outright if you knew the truth, afraid I wouldn't measure up to whatever image you had of the father you never knew. The admission of fear, of vulnerability, from someone Daniel had perceived as invincible seemed to reach him. His rigid posture softened slightly. I would have been angry, Daniel conceded after a long moment. But finding out like this, accidentally, it makes me wonder what else isn't true. Ask me anything, Jackson offered. No more secrets, no more protected truths. Whatever you want to know, I'll tell you, even if it doesn't paint me in a flattering light. Daniel considered this, his natural curiosity beginning to overcome his anger. Did you love her? My mom? Yes, Jackson answered without hesitation. She was my first love, and leaving her was the hardest thing I'd done at that point in my life. I convinced myself it was necessary for both our futures, but I carried that decision, that loss, with me even as I built my company and my fortune. And now? Why are you really in Boston? For me, or for her, or for your own guilty conscience? The directness of the question, so like Jackson's own tendency to cut to the heart of matters, almost made him smile despite the gravity of the moment. Initially, for you, he admitted. The moment I saw you at the reunion, everything changed. Suddenly all my achievements felt hollow compared to the son I never knew I had. But these months in Boston, he paused, searching for complete honesty. Being near your mother again, seeing the remarkable woman she's become, those old feelings haven't disappeared. Daniel absorbed this, his expression thoughtful. She never married, never even had serious boyfriends that I can remember. I used to think it was because she was too busy with me and her career, but maybe. He didn't finish the thought, but he didn't need to. Some wounds, even 16-year-old ones, never fully healed. Do you have any other children? Daniel asked suddenly. Any other families tucked away somewhere? No, Jackson said firmly. There's never been anyone serious enough for that. The company became my life, my identity, until now. They sat in silence for a moment, the hum of computer equipment the only sound in the otherwise empty room. Outside, snow had begun to fall, visible through the large windows that framed the MIT campus. I don't know how to feel, Daniel finally said, his voice smaller, younger. Part of me wants to stay angry. It would be easier. But another part, he swallowed hard. Another part of me is weirdly relieved. That it's you and not some stranger I've never met. I'll take weirdly relieved over hatred, Jackson said softly. It's a start. I still don't understand why. Mom didn't tell you back then, Daniel continued. Even if you might have chosen Stanford anyway, shouldn't you have had the right to know? Jackson nodded. That's something I struggled with too, when I first found out. But I've come to understand that she was protecting both of us. Protecting you from possible rejection and protecting me from having to make an impossible choice at 22. Was it the right decision, though? Daniel pressed. To decide for both of you. I don't think there was a right decision in that situation, Jackson replied honestly. There were just different paths with different consequences. Your mother chose the path she thought would cause the least damage to everyone involved. And she gave you a great life, Daniel. She's been both parents to you, and she's done an incredible job. Daniel nodded slowly. She has. He looked up at Jackson, really studying his face. This is so weird. I used to stare at photographs of you in tech magazines, trying to figure out why you seemed so familiar when I'd never met you. Now I realize I was basically looking in a mirror. The first time I saw you at the reunion, it was like seeing myself at 15, Jackson acknowledged. Down to the way you were hunched over your phone, coding when you should have been socializing. A ghost of a smile flickered across Daniel's face. That's not going to change, you know? The coding instead of socializing thing. I wouldn't want it to, Jackson replied. Though maybe we can work on better posture. My back reminds me daily of those hunched-over coding sessions. The small joke, the tentative step toward normalcy, hung between them like an offering. After a moment, Daniel's shoulders relaxed further. I can't promise to be okay with everything right away, he said carefully. This is a lot to process. I understand, Jackson said. You set the pace. You decide what this relationship looks like going forward. I'm just grateful for the chance to be in your life. At all. Daniel stood hard, gathering his backpack and helmet. I should call Mom. She's probably freaking out. She is, Jackson confirmed, though she's trying not to show it. That's Mom, Daniel said, with a hint of his usual affection. Always trying to be strong for everyone else. He picked up his phone, then hesitated. What happens now? With us, I mean. That depends, Jackson replied, on whether you're willing to give me a chance to be the father I should have been from the beginning. Daniel considered this, then nodded slowly. I want to be angry with you, with both of you, for the lies. And part of me is, but I also want to know my father, Daniel admitted quietly. The real one, not the imaginary British professor or the tech mentor, just you. The simple statement contained within it all the forgiveness Jackson had feared would never come. I would like that very much, he said, his voice thick with emotion. As they left the building and walked through the gently falling snow to Jackson's car, Daniel asked, Can I tell you something weird? Of course. When I found that photo album, before I realized what it meant, I was looking at those old pictures of you and thinking how much we look alike. But he shook his head. I literally thought to myself, that's so strange. He could be my father. And then it hit me that you are. Sometimes the truth is right in front of us, Jackson said, but we don't recognize it until we're ready to see it. They drove through the quiet streets of Cambridge, the snowfall muffling the world around them, a clean, white slate stretching before them, ready for new paths to be written. 1 year later, the Boston Common sparkled under a perfect June. Sky as Jackson, Olivia, and Daniel made their way along the winding paths. Tourists and locals alike enjoyed the first truly warm weekend of the season, sprawling on the grass or paddling boats on the lagoon. I still can't believe MIT and Stanford are fighting over you, Jackson said, nudging Daniel's shoulder proudly. Though I maintain Stanford has the better computer science program. And the better weather, Daniel agreed with a grin. But MIT offered the better scholarship package, and it's closer to home. Home is important, Olivia said, her fingers lightly entwined with Jackson's. a recent development that Daniel had observed with knowing satisfaction. Though we'll support whatever you decide. The past year had brought changes none of them could have anticipated. Jackson had permanently relocated Ride Connect's secondary headquarters to Boston, dividing his time between coasts, but increasingly favoring the East. Focus Flow had launched as an official Ride Connect educational initiative, with Daniel credited as lead developer. The app now helping thousands of students manage their academic challenges. Jackson had moved from his temporary townhouse to a spacious Victorian just a few blocks from Olivia's home in Cambridge. Close enough for convenience, but maintaining separate spaces while they navigated their rekindled relationship. Holidays were spent together, Daniel's grandparents gradually warming to Jackson's presence in their lives after initial suspicion. There had been challenges too, Daniel's occasional bursts of residual anger about the deception, Jackson's struggles to balance parental authority with his desire to be liked, Olivia's fears about opening her heart again to the man who had once broken it. But they had faced each obstacle with the honesty they'd promised each other that night at MIT, gradually building a family structure that felt both new and somehow inevitable. "Oh, I meant to tell you," Daniel said suddenly, pulling out his phone. The user feedback from the school district in Chicago came in. They're seeing a 63% improvement in assignment completion rates among students with executive functioning challenges. "That's remarkable," Jackson said, genuine pride warming his voice. "You've created something that's making a real difference in people's lives." "We created it," Daniel corrected. "I couldn't have done it without your guidance. Or without my constant reminders to eat and sleep," Olivia added dryly. "You two would forget basic human needs if left to your coding frenzies." They reached the lake, where paddle boats shaped like swans glided across the water. A group of teenagers Daniel's age waved from the shore, friends from the robotics club who'd arranged to meet them. "Mind if I—" Daniel gestured toward his friends. "Go ahead," Olivia said. "We'll meet you at the ice cream stand in an hour." They watched as Daniel jogged over to his friends, immediately falling into animated conversation about something on another boy's tablet. "He seems happy," Jackson observed as they found a bench overlooking the water. "He is," Olivia confirmed. "We all are." Against considerable odds. Jackson squeezed her hand gently. "When I returned for that reunion, I thought I had everything figured out. My company, my future, my definition of success. I'd never been more wrong in my life." Olivia smiled, leaning into his shoulder slightly. "We took the scenic route, but we got here eventually. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd told me about the pregnancy back then?" Jackson asked, the question that had occasionally haunted him since discovering Daniel. Olivia considered this carefully. "Sometimes. But then I look at who we are now compared to who we were then. 22-year-old Jackson and Olivia might have tried to make it work and ended up resenting each other. Or you might have sent child support but remained distant. Or 1,000 other scenarios." She turned to face him. "But we'll never know that alternate timeline. We only have this one, and despite the detours, I'm grateful for where we've landed." Across the water, Daniel looked back at his parents and waved, his face alight with the confidence of a young man secure in who he was and where he belonged. Jackson waved back, overwhelmed as always by the simple miracle of his son's existence and the second chance he'd been given to be part of it. "I spent 15 years chasing success," Jackson said quietly, "never realizing that my greatest achievement was right here all along." Success, Jackson had finally learned, wasn't measured in stock prices or market share, but in moments like these, unexpected blessings that no algorithm could calculate and no fortune could buy. A family he never knew he needed, reconstructed from the choices of the past and reaching toward a future full of possibility. What did you think of the story? Leave a comment and a review about this story. If you were moved and enjoyed our work, feel free to help us continue producing. I invite you to click on our link in the first pinned comment. Now, 2 buttons will appear, one to subscribe, if you haven't already, and the other to watch other interesting stories. Choose one. Thank you for watching this far. See you soon.